The first report arrived in Natchez in the winter of 1836, folded into a packet of routine correspondence, and dismissed by almost everyone who read it. It described a river plantation where labor output had increased sharply, while the enslaved population had visibly declined. It mentioned unexplained deaths, strange nighttime activity along the bluffs, and a landowner who refused inspection even from men who technically outranked him. The clerk who logged the report wrote a single note in the margin before filing it away. Probably exaggeration, river folk talk. By the time anyone realized the exaggeration ran in the opposite direction, Hawthorne Bend no longer existed. The Mississippi that year moved heavy and brown, swollen with winter rains and dragging whole trees southward like offerings. The river always had a sound in that stretch of land, a low, constant pressure, as if it were thinking. Hawthorne Bend sat on a rise above one of its widest curves, a long sweep of water that caught the sun in the morning and reflected it back like polished metal. The plantation house was built to face that bend, 3 stories of whitewashed brick, with a columned gallery and wide windows meant to signal permanence. Power liked to pretend it would last forever. The man who owned it, Jonathan Whitlow, believed that more deeply than most. Whitlow was not born to wealth. His father had been a boatman who ferried goods between river towns and died broke. Jonathan learned early that survival depended on proximity to power, and power depended on appearing inevitable. By 30, he owned land. By 40, he owned people. By 52, Hawthorne Bend was spoken of with a mix of envy and unease, because it produced more cotton per acre than any comparable holding in Adams County. Whitlow explained this through discipline and innovation. Others whispered different explanations. He rarely attended church. He never entertained guests overnight. His enslaved population turned over constantly. Men and women purchased in groups and then quietly sold off within a year, their replacements arriving by river under cover of night. Official records showed nothing illegal. Everything was documented. Everything was tidy. What wasn't tidy were the gaps. Children listed on manifests who never appeared in census tallies. Men recorded as skilled laborers who vanished without bills of sale. Women marked unsuitable within weeks of purchase, then never seen again. The overseers changed often, and none stayed long. Those who left spoke of strange rules. Fields worked in silence, night labor forbidden on pain of death, yet lanterns moving among the trees long after midnight. A section of land near the bluff that no one was allowed to enter, fenced off not for livestock but for people. One man, drunk and shaking in a Natchez tavern, said Whitlow didn't farm cotton so much as feed something with it. Most laughed him out of the room. The story truly began, though no one knew it at the time, when Elias Mercer arrived. Mercer was listed as a surveyor in state records, contracted to assess river erosion along privately owned bluffs. In reality, he worked for a quiet office in New Orleans that handled problems wealthy men preferred not to explain. Disappearances, property disputes involving human beings, incidents where official law could not be seen intervening. Mercer was chosen because he did not look like a threat. He was thin, soft-spoken, and dressed like a clerk. He had a habit of listening longer than necessary and asking questions that seemed naive until they weren't. He arrived at Hawthorne Bend in early March, when the ground was still soft and the river had not yet settled into its summer rhythm. Whitlow greeted him on the gallery with the courtesy reserved for inferiors who might still be useful. "You'll find the bluff quite stable," Whitlow said, gesturing toward the river. "We've had it assessed before." "I'm sure," Mercer replied, setting down his satchel. "My task is mostly confirmation." Whitlow smiled in a way that suggested he disliked confirmation. Mercer spent his first 2 days measuring land he had already been told was sound. He worked slowly, deliberately. He made notes about soil density and tree roots and water patterns. But what he watched were the people. The enslaved workers avoided his eyes entirely, not out of fear of punishment, he'd seen that before, but out of something closer to instruction, as if they had been taught that seeing too much was dangerous. One woman, older than the others, paused while carrying water and looked directly at him, just once. Her face held no expression at all. Then she resumed walking, as if nothing had happened. That night, Mercer heard singing, not the rhythmic work songs common to plantations, but something low and irregular, drifting up from the riverbank. It stopped abruptly when he rose from bed. On the 3rd night, he followed it. He waited until the house had gone quiet, then slipped outside with his notebook tucked under his arm. The moon was thin, barely enough to light the path, but the sound guided him, down past the quarters, beyond the fields, toward the fenced-off stretch of land by the bluff. The fence gate was open. Inside, the ground dipped sharply, forming a natural bowl shielded from view by trees. At its center stood a structure Mercer had not seen in any official records. Low, wide, built from river stone and timber, half sunk into the earth, the singing came from there. Mercer crept closer, heart pounding. He smelled iron before he saw anything, then heat, then light. He looked through a narrow opening between stones and saw men standing in a circle, white men, well dressed even now. Whitelow stood among them. At the center of the circle was a pit. Something moved inside it. Mercer staggered back, bile rising in his throat. A hand closed around his shoulder. He screamed. The sound never reached the house. By morning, Elias Mercer was gone. Whitelow reported him as having left early, satisfied with his findings. The river office in New Orleans received Mercer's satchel 2 weeks later, delivered by courier. Inside was only one page of notes, smeared and unfinished. "They are not farming the land," it read. "They are feeding it." The office filed the report under unresolved matters. A junior clerk marked it for follow-up. There was no follow-up. 6 months later, Hawthorne Bend burned. The fire was said to have started in the lower storage buildings and spread uphill, driven by river winds. By dawn, the house was a blackened shell. Whitlow was dead. So were several prominent men from neighboring counties who had been visiting. No bodies from the enslaved quarters were recovered. The land was declared cursed by locals and sold cheaply. No one farmed it again. Years later, fishermen claimed the river there pulled harder, as if something beneath the water had grown restless. And occasionally, when the moon was thin and the current slowed, people swore they heard singing, low, irregular, hungry. The first person to trespass on the ruins of Hawthorne Bend after the fire was a boy who did not know what he was walking into. His name was Caleb Dorr, 16 years old, the son of a ferryman who worked the Natchez crossing. Boys like Caleb learned the river early. They learned where the current pulled strongest, where logs collected, where the water turned strangely cold even in summer. They also learned which stretches of land adults avoided and pretended not to notice. Hawthorne Bend was one of those places. Caleb went there in August of 1837, chasing a stray dog that had followed him upriver and then bolted when thunder rolled. He crossed the old boundary fence without realizing it, stepping into ground that felt wrong under his boots, softer than it should have been, as though the earth had never fully settled after the fire. The ruins were quieter than the woods around them. No insects, no birds, just the river breathing below. Caleb found the cellar entrance first, half collapsed and choked with ash. He did not go down. What stopped him was the smell, faint but unmistakable, like rust left too long in water. He backed away, heart racing, and that was when he saw the marks. Deep grooves cut into the exposed stone near the bluff. Not tool marks, not erosion, too deliberate, too curved. He ran. That night, Caleb dreamed of the river rising without rain, swallowing the banks and creeping up toward the town. He woke screaming, and for weeks afterward, refused to go near Hawthorne Bend. His father beat him for his cowardice. The river did not care. By the following year, similar stories surfaced in towns along the Mississippi, always small at first. A missing laborer here, a burned-out plantation there, a man of means found dead in circumstances that made no sense. The pattern went unnoticed because it did not look like a pattern, until Margaret Hale began collecting it. Hale was a widow in her early 40s, living in New Orleans, with just enough inherited money to be unimportant and just enough independence to be dangerous. Her husband had died of fever 5 years earlier, leaving her a house full of books and no one to tell her what questions not to ask. She volunteered at the same river office that had once employed Elias Mercer, cataloging reports no one else wanted. She was methodical, patient, and she remembered names. Mercer's file caught her attention because it had never been closed. She found the note about Hawthorne Bend, the single smeared page, the lack of follow-up. Then she began looking for similar cases. There were more than anyone realized. Plantations with sudden spikes in productivity followed by catastrophe. Owners who vanished or died violently. Land sold cheaply and left unused. Always near water, always near older trade routes, and always whispers. Hale traveled under the pretense of visiting relatives, collecting stories in parlors and kitchens, listening more than she spoke. People were willing to talk if they believed they were talking to someone who already knew. In Natchez, an elderly woman told her about a night when the river glowed faintly red near the bend. In Vicksburg, a former overseer described a gathering he had been invited to once and fled from before it began. In Baton Rouge, a freedman spoke of a place where the land demanded payment. Hale wrote everything down. By 1840, she had a theory she did not yet dare put into words. Something was being passed along the river, not as a thing, but as a practice. She returned to Hawthorne Bend that autumn, accompanied by a local guide who refused to go closer than the fence. Hale went on alone. The ground had reclaimed much of the ruin. Grass grew where walls had been, but the cellar mouth was still visible, a dark wound in the earth. She stood there for a long time, notebook in hand, listening. She heard nothing. That was worse. When Hale finally descended, lantern held high, she found the pit empty, clean, too clean. The stone walls bore marks where something had been scraped away, and on the far wall, carved deeply into the rock, were symbols she had seen before in other places, always half hidden, always dismissed as folk markings or idle graffiti. She traced them with her fingers, feeling the grooves catch her skin. This was not a cult, she realized. It was a system. The river was not a boundary, it was a road. And Hawthorne Bend was not the end of it, it was where it had failed. Hale left the ruins before nightfall, unaware she was no longer alone. From that day forward, her letters began to go missing. A package of notes disappeared en route to St. Louis. A journal she mailed to herself never arrived. A man she had interviewed was found drowned a week later, his boat overturned in calm water. Someone had noticed her. In the spring of 1841, Hale received an invitation written in an unfamiliar hand, sealed with black wax. It asked her to attend a gathering upriver, at a place called Briar Reach. The letter said only this: "You are asking the wrong questions in the wrong places. Come learn the right ones." Against every instinct she went. Briar Reach sat on a narrow tributary, hidden from the main river by a tangle of reeds. The house was newer than Hawthorne Bend, smaller, less ostentatious, built to avoid notice. The men who greeted her were polite, too polite. She counted 9 of them. They spoke of land stewardship, of old knowledge, of balance. They spoke as if reciting something learned long ago. When Hale asked about Hawthorne Bend, the room went quiet. One man finally spoke. "That was a mistake," he said. "The river does not forgive waste." Hale understood then what Mercer had seen too late. The river was not their god, it was their witness, and witnesses, if fed enough, could be persuaded to forget. That night, Hale did not sleep. She wrote. She hid pages in the lining of her dress, under floorboards, inside books. She memorized names and faces. When they came for her before dawn, she did not resist. She screamed. Someone, somewhere, heard her. That scream did not stop at Briar Reach. It traveled. They killed Margaret Hale 3 days after she screamed, and in doing so, they made the first mistake that mattered. They believed the river would erase her the way it had erased so many others. They bound her wrists and ankles, weighted her with iron, and lowered her into the tributary just before dawn, when mist lay thick enough to blur the world. One of the men whispered a phrase he had learned from his father, and his father before him. Another cut his palm and let blood drip into the water. A final offering meant to seal the forgetting. Hale went under alive. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that Hale had already won. She had sent a final packet the night before she left New Orleans, addressed not to an office or an authority, but to a person she trusted because he was considered irrelevant. Jonah Pike was a printer, not a publisher, not an editor, a printer, the man who set type and ran presses for other people's words. He was in his late 20s, quiet, with ink-stained fingers and a reputation for never asking why. Margaret Hale had asked him why once, years earlier, and he had answered honestly, because questions ruined good paper. She had smiled and trusted him. The packet arrived 2 weeks after Hale disappeared. Inside were fragments, notes without explanation, names without context, sketches of symbols, lists of dates that meant nothing on their own, and one letter, written in a firm, unafraid hand. "If you are reading this," Hale wrote, "I am dead or very close to it. That means what I feared is real, and it is older than law. You must not try to understand everything. You must only make it impossible to forget. Print what you can, scatter it. Let people see pieces before anyone can stop you." Jonah Pike did not understand what he was holding, but he understood presses. Within a month, pamphlets began appearing in river towns. Anonymous, cheaply printed, easy to dismiss. They spoke of fires and disappearances. They listed names of prominent men alongside dates of unexplained deaths. They reproduced symbols without explanation. Most people laughed. Some felt uneasy. A few recognized the markings and burned the papers immediately. That was how the network realized it had a problem. The river began misbehaving that same summer. Floods came out of season. Banks collapsed without warning. Barges struck submerged objects that should not have been there. Fish floated belly up in stretches that had fed communities for generations. People said it was God. Others said it was the river remembering. At Briar Reach, the men met more often now. Anxious, angry, they argued about Hale, about the printer, about whether they had fed the water enough or too much. One of them suggested stopping. He was found dead 2 days later, crushed beneath a fallen beam in his own home. The river did not touch him. By 1843, the pamphlets had reached as far as Cincinnati. The symbols appeared carved into docks, chalked on warehouse walls, scratched into church pews. No one knew who was doing it. Everyone knew it felt like a warning. The network began to fracture. Some chapters abandoned the old practices entirely, burning their records and sealing their pits. Others doubled down, convinced the river demanded greater devotion. A few turned on each other, accusing rivals of causing the instability. Violence spread inward. The river towns suffered, but the men who had believed themselves insulated suffered more. Then, in the winter of 1845, a body surfaced near the ruins of Hawthorne Bend. It was impossible. The corpse was bloated, preserved strangely well, hair drifting like dark weeds. The face was unrecognizable, but stitched into the clothing was a scrap of paper, ink still legible. These places do not belong to you. No one claimed the body. No one buried it. Spring brought the reckoning. A flood unlike any before it tore through the lower Mississippi, swallowing plantations, splitting banks, collapsing bluffs that had stood for centuries. Briar Reach vanished overnight. The house pulled into the tributary, as if dragged by hands. Witnesses swore they saw lights beneath the water as it happened. By the time the flood receded, the system was gone, not destroyed, broken. The men who survived scattered. Some fled west. Some changed names. Some convinced themselves it had all been coincidence, a bad dream, a superstition that had gone too far. But none of them ever went near the river again. Jonah Pike died in 1861, just before the war reached New Orleans. In his shop, hidden behind false shelving, was a box of type locked into strange combinations. When arranged correctly, they formed the symbols Hale had drawn. The box disappeared during the chaos of occupation. In 1898, a teacher in Natchez wrote about old songs passed down among Black River communities. Songs that mentioned fire, water, and men who fed the land until the land ate them back. In 1932, dredging crews pulled up stone blocks carved with familiar grooves near Hawthorne Bend. The blocks were quietly reburied. In 1974, a graduate student cataloging pamphlets found several anonymous prints with identical type flaws, traced to a long-defunct New Orleans press. Her notes went missing, and even now, when the river runs low and the mud pulls back, people say you can see shapes in the banks where nothing should be carved. They say the water sounds different there, heavier, watchful. The truth never fully surfaced. It didn't need to. It lived in fragments, in warnings half understood, in places people avoided without knowing why, in the quiet knowledge that some power structures do not collapse, they rot, and when they do, they poison everything around them. Hawthorne Bend failed because it tried to own what only observes. Margaret Hale failed because she believed truth could be contained. The river endured because it remembers everything. And if you listen carefully, on certain nights when the current slows and the moon is thin, you can still hear it, not singing, not chanting, but something older, a sound like names being spoken, one by one, never forgotten.